Hello, and welcome to Wrestling with Poetry, Kalamazoo, Michigan's premier wrestling and poetry podcast. This week, Gabriel Kruis and wrestlers who become professional actors. I want to start the show off strong, so we're going to start with Gabe. Gabriel Kruis is the author of Acid Virga, Archway Editions 2020, and a co-founder of Wendy's Subway. Originally from New Mexico, he currently resides in Malmö, Sweden.
Hello, Wrestling with Poetry listeners. Hello, Ish. I'm thrilled to be the featured poet this week. But before I read a poem from my debut collection, Acid Virga, I want to put on the longtime listener, first-time caller hat and make a comment about something that was discussed in a previous episode, and to ask a question or speculate about something that's interested me for nigh on 2 decades. So first of all, I'm thinking about the question, and I have been thinking about the question of the relationship of boxing to poetry and how it is perceived by the culture to be poetry in motion or embodied in some way. And the caller made the assertion that maybe wrestling was a better analog, which Ish agreed with, and I don't take any contention with it at all. But I do think it's interesting, or I had a kind of brainwave about the relationship of boxing to poetry that I think is relevant and worth talking about. My mind went immediately to watching The Sopranos a couple of years ago, the scene in which Tony is in the hospital. He's had a heart attack, and he's kind of thinking about his place in the world. The rapper Deluxe has been shot 7 times, and he's in the hospital. And then a gentleman from Bell Labs, he's a physicist, I think. They all kind of get together in Deluxe's room to watch a boxing match. And they're talking about the match and one individual fighter in particular, and the guy from Bell Labs, it's maybe a little bit overly philosophical, but he basically says, there is no single boxer. There are only the 2 boxers together. There is no individual units. They're basically like waves in an ocean or currents of wind that are co-determinative of each other. And especially in the moment of them fighting, they have this experience of being one, in a sense. And I kind of think it's an interesting metaphor for the reader and the writer, the idea that the poem is maybe kind of the ring. I don't like the metaphor of fighting necessarily or battling, but I do think that there's a certain amount of rigor and rhythm and maneuvering that both the writer and the reader make when they're reading or writing a poem. And that to me feels closer to boxing than wrestling, in the sense that wrestling feels very spectacle oriented. It feels oriented toward an audience that is a group of people rather than the relationship to an individual, and each individual maybe will change the stakes of the boxing match. And I think in that sense, it feels like a good metaphor to me. But I also really like the idea of the clinch. I think it was called the clinch that Ish mentioned, which is when the boxers have to slow down, and there's this kind of intense moment of intimacy where they're kind of hugging, and they're breathing heavily, and they're holding each other, and there's a kind of sense in which that they truly become, if not one, supremely intimate in a way that is maybe also suggestive of the relationship when you've read a good poem and you suddenly feel like you've passed through the other side, or you can see through the page to the other side, or the poem is reached inside of you, and you suddenly have that experience of intimacy. So that's my thought, and I have a question or a kind of speculation. I have been long fascinated by the role reversal in cinema of wrestlers like Hulk Hogan in Mr. Nanny, or I think the pacifier is Vin Diesel, but it's a kind of similar scenario. He's not a wrestler, but he has a kind of wrestler's body, and I feel like John Cena has been put in a similar position, and The Rock, and it's almost this kind of trope of putting the wrestlers who are actors into the role of caretaker, and they're also defender, but they kind of have this interesting in the ring it's all about ego, it's all about performance, outward performance, and it's not about that intimacy and caretaking. So I'm fascinated by that, and I'm curious to hear what you think about that, Ish. Now I'm going to read the first poem in my book, and the reason why I think it relates to wrestling is because it feels kind of like a tag team, or maybe like a battle royale, and I certainly think that I was wrestling with a particular set of ideas, and I needed to tag in or learn moves maybe from other poets. And so it's a kind of cento, which means that I've stolen lines from other poets to comprise the poem, but it feels very much my own in the sense that it's deliberately constructed to be a kind of syllogism or argument that is circular, and doesn't quite resolve. And so this poem is called Say. Say poetry's air, money's ore, or poetry's a kind of money. Say dirt and not copper make a color darker, and makes the shape so heavy and makes no melody harder. Or say there's money, but it rusted. Say poetry's not a luxury, and I know I am space, my body's air. Or this is a shape of blood beating and cells dividing, but outside of this shape is space. Say thus the air's a luminous shadow which accompanies the body, or poetry's the body's body. I had the impulse at the end of reading that to just talk about one line in particular, in terms of this idea of stealing moves or tag teams, which is poetry's a kind of money. And I think different people will recognize that line from different places, but I came across it in both Vanessa Place, who's kind of maybe a bit of a heel in the poetry world, and Wallace Stevens, I think, originated a line that is either exactly that or quite like it. And then Kay Ryan also uses a line very much like that. And, I think that there's a way in which these poets are, at least the subsequent poets after Stevens, are kind of battling it out with each other around a kind of philosophical relationship to poetry, or their particular poetics, or they're totally ignorant of each other's references here, and each of them found that idea intriguing, as I do. So, in terms of stealing lines or using other people's techniques, I'm really curious to hear your thoughts, Ish. Thank you for having me, and support your local wrestling, support poetry, and support each other. All right, bye.
Thank you, Gabe. That was absolutely beautiful. Now, regarding tough guys who become caregivers in movies, yes, that is a thing. Think about Drax in Guardians of the Galaxy. But first, Mr. Nanny. What I gleaned from the preview is that Hulk Hogan has to protect a scientist's children because terrorists are targeting them as a way to get to their scientist father. I didn't notice a mother figure in the preview. And Hogan had to not beat up the children, even though they seem to be torturing him. So I think they're sort of like a tough guy has to restrain himself element. Considering he's a wrestler, it feels a little like karma. You consider wrestlers have to know that everything they do, kids are going to do exactly what they do. So there's kind of a weird element of payback, it seems to me, going from the preview. Hogan has to not beat up the children, even though they seem to be torturing him. I also think, here's what I'm guessing will happen in the movie, that terrorists will abduct them all. And my guess is that Hulk Hogan will go wild on the terrorists and in this way gain the children's respect. We'll see. Now, in Guardians of the Galaxy Part 3, the Drax character, played by the former pro wrestler Dave Bautista, becomes a protector of the vulnerable people. Not just because he's a guardian of the galaxy, but he actually has a realization in the third one. But I don't want to ruin that. What I think is also important to note is that Dave Bautista, or Drax, he gives care the way a wrestler would give care, not the way Bertrand Russell would, because part of caring is honestly revealing the threats of the world and teaching the person how to manage them. I think a wrestler knows this, and I also think it's a better way to give care rather than to... Well, maybe it's not better. I mean, maybe you can protect yourself entirely with your mind. That's possible. But will you know the threat as well? I don't know. Some other great actors that I think are compelling to watch. This is a very limited list. Roddy Piper, who was in They Live, and there's some wrestling in it. I think Dwayne Johnson is terrific because I really liked Moana. Also, Dave Bautista, again, he's in Blade Runner 2049. So it seems like they're taking acting really seriously, and it shows. There are also some current wrestlers who are in the acting field like Sasha Banks and John Cena. Next week, I wish to give more time to this fascinating question about using other people's techniques. Is it stealing? This relates to both poetry and wrestling moves. It is going to be its own wrestling topic. I'm going to give you a trigger warning for next week. There is going to be more talk of the mandible claw because it's a very good illustration of a move that many people take credit for to this day. Now, events. Independence Pro Wrestling comes to Royal Scott in Lansing, Michigan on Saturday, August 26th. That's Independence Pro Wrestling presents Off the Chain. Doors open at 6 p.m. and the match starts at 7 p.m. Poetry open mic at Satellite Records right here in Kalamazoo. That's 808 Southwest Nedge Avenue, and it will be Thursday from 5:30 to 6:30 p.m. It is a good time, and it's a great place to hear work and share work. Musicians are also welcome. I hope you've enjoyed this show as much as I have. And if you have any questions or concerns, email them and we'll address them. wrestlingwithpoetry@gmail.com. Thank you so much for listening. I hope you have a great week.